We were skiing in Idaho in September, and it was just 18 hours after I had asked her to marry me. We were on a double black diamond, and the conditions weren't ideal, but we couldn't not ski because we had flown over 2,000 miles to do just that. We had just gotten off of the lift, and we had both taken a couple big steps to get speed, and I was probably 5 to 8 feet ahead of her when I saw her falling out of the corner of my eye. I saw her tumbling, and then, before I had a chance to even react, I heard the two loudest snapping sounds, almost like you would hear if you were breaking two thick sticks. It was loud, unique sounding, and unsettling. There was also a third sound that sounded like a gunshot. I'd actually pondered she'd been shot, but quickly realized that couldn't be the case because I didn't hear that loud noise until she'd already started to fall. Of course I couldn't stop, because I was going down a pretty steep hill, but I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing a good portion of her leg hanging almost like a large piece of spaghetti off to the side, and then I heard her screaming for help. I got to the bottom of the hill, and it was at least 20 minutes if not longer until Sydney got to the bottom of the mountain. She was being dragged down by a skimobile. Her left leg was completely hidden under an enormous black splint. I could hear her crying the entire time. When she got to the bottom of the hill, she told me she had snapped both of her shin bones, and that she was fucked. I told her I loved her. She told me she loved me. The next time I saw her was at the hospital about 3 hours later. She had fractured her tibia and fibula, both about halfway up her shin, and each was a clean break, which was concerning because the shin bone gets thicker as it gets closer to the knee. So to snap both of those bones took a large amount of force. She also tore her Achilles tendon, which accounted for that loud gunshot-like noise I'd heard. She'd be staying at the hospital for a few days as they were waiting for the immense amount of swelling to go down. Because there were several injuries to her leg, any slight movement was causing her so much discomfort and pain that they decided to keep it immobilized right away. That night they put a plaster cast on her leg that went from the top of her thigh down to her toes. They cut it down the sides to accommodate for the swelling. I went back to the hotel to get some sleep that night, and the next morning was back at the hospital early. I went into her room and immediately saw the huge cast on her leg. It was being held in place by 4 different straps, each affixed within the plaster with buckles. Now you have to know that my fiancée is always extremely horny, no matter what we're doing. She has an incredibly high sex drive, and at 5'4", she has enormous breasts and an extremely robust derriere. So obviously her legs are not small. If she was going to be put into a cast, this was going to be an enormous one, her thighs pretty ample. I love a full-figured woman, and Sydney was that then some. I always call her my buxom beauty. At 34 years old, I had never been with anyone so well endowed, and despite the fact that Sydney was only 23, I knew I had to ask her to marry me, because I would never get this lucky again in my life, and I was truly in love with her, and she with me. I went right up to her bed and grabbed her hand and sat down. She was so uncomfortable because her leg was in such bad shape that not only was she in a full leg plaster cast, but the cast itself was tethered to the side of her bed with 2 large rubber cords. I saw her glance at the door, and then, when she realized that we were alone, she took my hand and placed it underneath her hospital gown, and said, "Feel how high my cast goes," and then right away took my hand and placed it in her crotch with no intention on me feeling the cast. She knew that she was able to move and would be in this immobile, awful position for a while, and needed her fiancé's touch right then and there. I began laughing and said, "Honey, you never stop, do you?" She wasn't in the mood for talking though, as she tried, guiding my hand into her crotch, which was a little difficult to navigate because of the enormous cast. Very gently, I started massaging. Despite her leg and Achilles tendon being in 2 different pieces, she was quivering enough for the metal undercarriage of the bed to start shaking. The doctor came in shortly after, and I think he realized he'd caught us in the act. "She really shouldn't be moving at all," he said to me, with Sydney right there listening. "Sorry, doctor," she said, grimacing. "We need to get more X-rays and an MRI, Sydney. he said. She asked him when her surgery was going to be likely to happen. He told us that because she had both broken her leg and ruptured her Achilles, she was in a rough position. He said it was going to be difficult to treat both injuries at once, and that most likely she wasn't going to have surgery, and that cast immobilization was probably going to be the best chance of her healing. He said that she would be non-weight bearing for the rest of the year, and most likely in a cast for the next 5 months. She asked the staff if she could speak to me privately, and the doctor said, of course, and left the room. Sydney asked me if I could kiss it. She didn't mean her injuries. She wanted oral sex. I told her this probably wasn't a good idea considering, we were in a hospital room. Her leg was broken. Her Achilles was torn, and she was basically chained to the bed. She touched the back of my head and then started pushing it downward. When I got down there to survey the scene, I was extremely shocked by the size of this cast. They had taken it all the way up into her crotch, and I can only guess how many rolls of plaster they needed, because this was enormous. My face was pressed against plaster the entire time. After about 10 minutes, I asked her if she was good. She said, "Keep going, honey, please." About 2 minutes later, a nurse came in the room. Not sure she knew exactly what was going on, but if she did, she ignored it and walked in and said, "I need Sydney. Gotta take her into the X-ray room." She then put her fingers in the foot opening of the cast and tugged on it, I'm assuming to make sure it wasn't getting too tight with the swelling. She then did the same thing at the opening around her thigh. She put her hand inside the top of it, and was surprised, and then put her hand inside where her hip is, then stops and asks, "What's going on here? It's soaking wet. Did you spill something?" "Something like that," Sydney said, glancing at me with a smirk. I remember my cheeks rubbing up against the small amount of padding at the top of her cast, and feeling how drenched it was. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. "You're gonna need a new cast." I waited in her room, and she was gone for about 2 hours. I was surprised to see a new pink cast, even though the nurse had said she was going to need a new one because the first one was all wet. Once we were alone, she wasted no time in pushing my head down into her crotch again. She chuckled, "Ready to get this one all wet?" As you can see from the picture that I took, there isn't a lot of room down there. This one seemed to have more layers around the top cuff, and so it was even thicker. It looked like there were at least 5 or 6 wraps of fiberglass around the top. I asked her how many rolls of fiberglass they use for this cast, and she said I stopped counting at 15. It was the weirdest sexual interaction I've ever had with a woman, as moans of pleasure were being interspersed with screeches of pain. I asked her if she could feel her toes, and I put my hand in the opening of her cast to touch them. She said she couldn't feel them yet. She said she couldn't get the thought out of her head of her foot and the bottom of her shin just hanging in front of her, pointing 180 degrees the wrong way. She started crying, and I pulled my head up, very gratuitously. Because my face had been scratched by the fiberglass extremely badly, it felt like it wasn't 5 minutes until another nurse came in and told Sydney that they needed more MRIs because her breaks and Achilles tear was so unusual they needed more looks at it. She started crying right away, and I couldn't blame her. This was absolutely a horrific thing to go through at 23 years old. I watched as they put her in a wheelchair, and her casted leg was just dangling, as you can see in the picture. I felt awful.